The beauty, the clarity, the power, the precision, the mystery of a metaphor, are these qualities not sufficient by themselves? Hence, are they not ends? We don't expect more of a flower than its beauty. What's wrong, therefore, with a metaphor for the sake of metaphor? The fellow has made me forget that the metaphor has a referent subject matter, and that the best argument for the metaphor is that it endows the referent with these qualities. We expect more of a metaphor, therefore, than of a flower. As long as it has a referent, we must expect it to be for the referent, but not entirely. Entirely would make it a dull fellow. A certain amount must be allowed for an existence in language, an existence always there and never identical to subject matter. The question is, how much? And the answer comes from man's connection to earth. It doesn't matter how much, so long as it doesn't detract from subject matter. For why should one be willing to give up one jot of that? I see no need to. One can have both. But this now plunges us outside literary considerations. For the amount of subject matter that the poet is willing to sacrifice or compromise depends on his individual psychology. If he is turned primarily inward, there is nothing to restrain him from going all the way to euphues. But if his feelings for the outer world are solid and grounded in character, he'll keep his head against the charisma of metaphor. He will not settle for charisma alone. But isn't it grand that we can have both the earth and metaphor? Next rascal is metaphor for the poet's own aggrandizement, which turns attention away from the poem to beam in on his powers of imagination and language. One is entitled to as much self-aggrandizement as one can get away with, which no individuality can survive. A plague of locusts would be preferable. Then there are metaphors in place of subject matter and thought, and metaphors in which the poet can escape from personality, and metaphors by which he can slip into a drug state, and metaphors that take over and lead him by the nose, and so on. But I've run ahead of myself. Looking back to my beginnings, I see now that there was only one kind of poetry which moved me then, the lyrical. With what condescension and disdain I expelled everything else. The memory is embarrassing. Then one day I myself transgressed. It happened after reading Cummings' poem, Buffalo Bill, I Think in the Dial. What delight! It touched a nerve in me that I didn't know I had, and a poem came to me as a counterpoint, a takeoff on early westerns. It was the opposite of lyrical, of romantic, of mystical, the opposite of everything I had done up to then. And it was without metaphor. I didn't have to compose it. The poem practically wrote itself. And form didn't seem to matter to it. It was fun writing, but I dismissed it as negligible. Sometime later, on another binge, I wrote The Experiment with a Rat. This poem took more composing, more form, but again no metaphors, and the opposite of lyrical and so on. This poem I took more seriously. With the writing of my Americana suite, mostly done without metaphor, it became apparent that a different part of my nature had broken out. Humor, satire, my bond to the everyday world. These poems had certain things in common. They all had a point to make, a realistic matter to reproduce, for which they needed no assistance from metaphor. It would have been extra baggage, a distraction, an enemy to the simple state in which all mental points have to be made. Narrative poetry, too, spurns metaphor. Who wants to be stopped in the flow of a story by the ambiguities and inner riches of metaphor? Similarly, in poetry in which the action itself stands for a larger meaning, the metaphor only impedes the symbolism. But no matter, the metaphor still haunts me. I know that what I was at my beginnings, romantic, lyrical, idealistic, had to have metaphors. In addition, I was possessed by the music of poetry, by overpowering inchoate feelings, elegiac, rhapsodic, mystical, by a sense of supernatural presences close by who would move out of their shadowy limbo and make themselves known to me if I allowed myself to go to them and listen. I stood at the edge, waiting. Would you try to express these things in literal language? Would you even be willing to admit to them as non-metaphorical states? In this duress, metaphor came to my aid, as it comes to everybody's, for it is a primary tool invented early in our evolution to cope with imperfection at both ends of the communication process, with some defect or inadequacy in the cognitive faculty, in its capacity to know exactly and in full what we are experiencing from moment to moment and what is before us, and with imperfections of language in its capacity to reproduce exactly and fully. Thus, the metaphor is staple in everyday talk. The moment we're stuck for perception or words, we reach for an analogy, metaphor in its simplest functional form. If we are meditating, the cognitive and lingual imperfections are far more complex. If, for example, I'm looking at a tree, what am I experiencing? There's no point in asking that question if no demands are made on me to reproduce the experience. In that case, experience is knowing. But if I have to reproduce it, neither my self-observation nor the language of direct statement is equal to the task. If I further ask the question, what is before me? I run into a maze just trying to understand my own question. And if I can get past that, I run into a wall. For the real tree is not penetrable to my inquiry. Of course, if I assume that the tree is what I see, there's no problem. I wind up with a physical description. But if I sense, as I do, that there's something more there, something sui generis that is not I, a character, presence, ambience in its own purpose and destiny, that is not what the scientist knows of its structure or its composition and function, then I'm in trouble, because I do not have access to these things. I must invent something to represent them. The chances are I'll start with a metaphor. And if I want to reproduce the tree's aesthetic effect on me, its particular beauty and grace, or my connection to it when I think of its durant heart, its destiny relative to man, the mystery of its great presence, the enumeration, however true, is never complete. It does not bring me any closer to the integral that is so moving about a tree. That is on a different plane from its parts and attributes. If, as I said, I want to reproduce all that, direct statement and descriptive words are of no use. If, in addition, I want to express my feelings about all of this. For sure, I need help and must invent the metaphorical tools for it. I see that almost without thinking, I have already done some of this in the words I used. It is possible that I have no more entree to a tree than a spider has to the wall on which it sits and spins. But does that matter? Metaphysical riddles never stopped anyone, not the solipsist himself, from following his natural bent and intuition. Pierre Riverdi plays this theme to death. Poetry, he writes, is not in the datum, but in the observant mind. I see no basis for such a dichotomy except in Riverdi's own natural bent toward solipsism. For if it held, it would follow that only the subject of poetry, that the only subject of poetry is the mind itself, the poet solipsist himself. We know that heavy presence, that long millennial dream from which one cannot awake because outside stimulus has been removed. We know its working principle, that subject matter is not the important thing, only the art of expressing it, that poetry has no responsibility to anything outside the poet himself, the man of unending surrealist excess and extravaganza. Unfortunately for him, nature, the nature of the reader, has the last word. Whatever exercises in solipsism may be to the poet, they are boring to others. Leaving the metaphor for a moment for your field, I have to add that it is a fundamental problem in writing that the emotions and the intellect mix very poorly. In fact, they don't mix at all, not only because their tones clash and they exist on different planes, but no sooner does one feel something than the mind butts in. It looks, describes, interprets, denatures, absorbs, controls, encapsulates. It imagines that it has made an even exchange because it does this with great wit, precision, and éclat. The fact is that it has no choice. If it did not move in on the emotion, it would have nothing to do and no reason for being. The trouble is that when it's through, the emotion is no longer there, only its mental ectoplasm. Yet emotion without intellect is slob. Only the mind can give it form and make it look and act the way it should in a poem. How to do this, then, with as little loss to the emotion as possible? By confining the intellect to suggestion, and by expressing the emotion in the medium in which it is most directly expressed, music. In a poem, the music of the lines. Or in a medium which uses the associations that go with certain images and configurations. This excerpt from Denise Levertaux's poem, Illustrious Ancestors, is an example. She writes, "Well, I would like to make poems direct as what the birds said, hard as a floor, sound as a bench, mysterious as the silence, when the tailor would pause with his needle in the air." The first three similes here need no comment. They are definitive. But who is this tailor in the fourth simile? Well, from the context, quote, "The Rav of northern White Russia declined in his youth to learn the language of birds because the extraneous did not interest him. Nevertheless, when he grew old, it was found he understood them anyway, having listened well, and as it is said, prayed with the bench and the floor." Now, from that context, He is that slightly mystical character out of Yiddish literature and folklore, the ubiquitous Jewish tailor, lowly, obscure, philosophical, which God had made him for reasons known only to him. He and the Rav evoke the shtetl atmosphere as we know it from this literature in Tsarist Russia, from where Levertov's father came. As such, the poem is a figuration of nostalgia. This much is on a single plane. The words mysterious and silence, and would pause with his needle in the air, however, transport us to another plane. This simile is so much richer than its referent, so much more profound and resonant, that it displaces it at once. One no longer remembers that the poet was saying that she wished her poems to be like that. The wish seems unimportant now. This tailor is a far more hypnotic character in a poetic sense than the historical tailor or the tailor out of nostalgia. The simile has made him a figure of mystery, wherein the author has a heraldic existence, heraldic at first glance of a Jewish past unknown to her. On a deeper plane, heraldic of the mystery of silence, of the mystery of our inward state, where meditation sits timelessly on the question, what is being? In this heraldic universe, all know, the inhabitants are not subject to mortality. It is as if the mind had made a pact with language to that effect. Once its word, its metaphor is on the page, it shall live in perpetuity, independent of its referent and its author. The conditions in this habitat, the standards, the associations, the voice, the thing that is matter there, were not set by referent or author. When they enter it, therefore, they have to undergo a transformation and abide by those conditions. Balzacian reality is taken in by them and ceases to exist as such. It becomes depersonalized. Its life space becomes aesthetic space. Above all, it becomes enhanced, a distortion not tolerable in the real world. In this enhancement lies the poet's field for expressing his deepest longings for transcendence. Is this not the very air of the soul? To go beyond the ordinary, and beyond the excellent too, beyond what his mind can know, and his eyes can see, and his hand can write, to settle for nothing less than magic and language, to have no limits, an impossibility, broken when the word as symbol and metaphor transforms its referent into a heraldic thing, and its author into a heraldic being. Are these aspirations not romantic as the endeavor of writing itself, and also lyrical? The romantic sings. Where else can one's lyrical impulses and rhapsodic feelings go but in this enhancement? Or all those vague elegiac feelings and presentiments of the mystical that dog the poet, or the grandiose impulses of his ego and his need for immortality. Enter this metaphor and you take off in a self-contained, timeless space capsule where William James once sat when he wrote, "Immortality is one of the great spiritual needs of man." And Lev Luntz when he wrote in the Serapian Manifesto, "Art is as real as life itself, and like life, has no goal or meaning. It exists because it must." For matter to trope into imago the image as our way of knowing, of making matter conform to our mode of perception? How well I know this divine transmutation, yet I'm pulled equally towards the other pole and yearn to do what the stage designer Nikolai Akimov longed for. Writing during the early sanguine period of Russian communism, he said, "My fondest dream is to develop the expressiveness of things to a point where I need not be ashamed to put them on the stage beside the best of actors. As yet, this waits in utopia. But if I should ever succeed in bringing upon the stage a chair, the sight of which would make the audience, to a man, sob, I would die in peace." Exactly how I feel. So I stand by what I once wrote. Matter, with this look I wed thee, and become thy very attribute. I shall be thy faithful spouse, true to thy nature, for I love thee more than deer loved a seaweed. I don't write as that. That was forced on me. I'll read a few poems now that bear on the metaphor. And I use metaphor to include simile. That is, it's a process of analogy. It's a process of trying to understand something by comparing it to something that you don't understand. These have to do with the poet himself. Oh, wait. Oh. Maybe if I can you turn this up a little? Oh, it's not connected. I don't. Oh, it's a dead mic. Oh, I'm sorry. I can't do much more. Could you? On poetry itself, poetry. Its nature is to look both absolute and mortal, as if a boy had passed through, or the imprint of his foot had been preserved unchanged under the ash of Herculaneum. When he sat down to his desk in the morning, there was a voice weeping from the personal, which could not bear its frailty and longed for alleviation in some lovely figure or perception. Sometimes it spoke as if it knew it was going to be published. It needed no one and was neither modest nor superior, just sure and straight. When he heard it, he knew he had a good thing and wrote it down, at first plain and then as high character, as if he were discovering his nature. But the commitment had already been made to honesty and clarity. Why then did he have to go through all that strangeness? The execution. Poet opens a box. Empty. Where's the God? In syntax, on linguistic wires, out of sight. And longing, where's the God of that? It's been Englished. It bleeds no more. As the body of mystery to a field of force is the symbol. For approaching a mystery and for transcending, which is the origin of human nature and where all value is, as beauty is in the eye, there is a ceremony. So we must get on with the poem. The simile flew out of chance, belly aglow, but when he looked in for his breath, the light expired as from a firefly. Yet on the reader's earth, this was a pyramid of Cheops. Oh, eternal is its element. The metaphor. Another small universe of Adam enters on the great page and shines for a moment. Hola! Now, I didn't have to write the essay after all. I have a long poem here called Nine Natures of Metaphor. It's all here. And I could have said 72 natures of metaphor too, because being metaphor, you can write on and on and on about it. You see, after all, you're not talking about a precise thing, you're talking about an analogy. Nine natures of metaphor. It liberates its referent from matter. It is its own state, incommunicado, absolute. The author writes, quotes, "There is a destiny in form which led here. But its origin has been deleted like the circles which entered geometry and became a line. It governs by high portents, promissory in its language, and by illusion sits beyond understanding, and procreates on sight. Unchecked, it could occupy the earth. The moment it appears, it is a given, like the concept of atomic number. It is without soul, yet men follow it. Without matter, yet not incredible. It lies in amnion and approaches infinity. Nevertheless, I will not drink to it. I'll drink to iron, I'll drink to Shem, I'll drink to salamander, but not to that. Okay, a goddess, but hold on to your balls." By the way, those are from a long suite called The Poet, and these are some new poems in that suite. In what sense am I a minor observer, as in a dream, absorbed in the interior, a beardless youth, unaccountably remote, yet present at the action, reminding me faintly of Prufrock, a diminutive figure, barely discernible, seemingly ageless, escapes me. The original impulse to sing, compressed into one exultant note, breaks out of the chest space, vibrating along the shoulders in the presence of full-bodied womanliness, the eyes dark in the inner scene, the hair long and black, our dark lady, inmate of courtship. She does not speak. She is nameless. The reason for her presence here is unknown. A shepherd, vaguely associated, stands at a distance under a birch tree, causally playing a flute. Sweetness streams across, also from the balance and the position of each it issues. Neither moves. The scene is not matter that can pall or diminish. Its secret holds as fast as I. As in Giorgione, the suspense is eternal. This is another aspect of the poet's psyche. It's called the anti-worm. Descended from a rumor of classical irony filtered through Pound, which sits so high above wisdom, it appears literary and invulnerable, engraved there by the style, and reduces all to an adversary and runs a spit through human being before it can cry, ouch, without revealing who the ironist himself is or what he feels, and in the end becomes its own captive. That air of amusement, as if beyond experience. Who can resist that baffling smile, that sang-froid, regarded as the supreme wisdom, that superior manner? Alas, I am one without sang-froid. I mock myself. For man, O worm, you will extrude the anti-worm. The anti-worm, vain, nasty, condescending, my gargoyle. Leering bastard, do you mean to pursue yourself to the bitter end? Speak, counter voice. Why this? Are you familiar with the Greek statue, the Laocoon, in which a father and two sons are the coils of a serpent? Why this Laocoon of I? Am I less clear than other men? The prophet curse, moving stage props around for apocalyptic effect. All these heroics, when I should be scaled down to the pit stone in an honest moment. This is something that I see is happening in the psychology of the poet. He begins to worship his own imagination, and I call this obeisance to the imagination. Mysterious voluptuary, I cried, older than Silenus, more surprising than the carving of a Viking ship on a glaciated peak in Turkey. There I go again in that highfalutin babbling. You'd think I was in the presence of a god, irradiated, sublime. What a bookish business. Why am I pretending? From this sight of myself as golden boy I fled, but could not shed the Platonist who plays with nature and carries on a strange androgynous affair with women. Meditation. How quickly the imagination rushes in to fill silence with a mystique, and style, invisible, vinylizes tenderness. As fast as underdogs get even in the dark of the eyes. But the ego sits it out. And you, my black shoes, my loyal boys, you go with me everywhere as if I were an Olympian. This situation that the poet faces having to do with questions